Helen Parker, 85 years old, stood quietly in line at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. She wore a beige wool coat and leaned slightly on her cane. Beneath her feet, the tiled floor buzzed with the chaotic rhythm of hurried steps, rolling luggage, and boarding announcements echoing from the loudspeakers. In her right hand was a worn brown suitcase, one that had seen too many airports and held far more than clothes. Inside that modest case was something far more personal: her advanced prosthetic leg, the heavier model with a titanium knee joint and carbon fiber structure. After losing her leg to complications from diabetes 6 years ago, Helen had learned to live with determination. She now used a lightweight, temporary prosthetic to move short distances, like today's shuffle to the check-in counter. But for real walking, real life, she needed the one in her suitcase. This trip was a promise fulfilled. Her granddaughter, Lily, was turning 10, and Helen had promised to attend her birthday party in Portland. It had been years since they'd seen each other. Travel was hard, expensive, and lonely, but Helen had saved every penny of her fixed income for this. Nothing could stop her from going, except maybe a suitcase. At the front of the line, a young airline attendant named Marissa greeted Helen with a neutral expression. "Boarding pass and ID, please," Marissa said politely but mechanically. Helen handed her documents over and slowly lifted her suitcase into the scale. Beep. Marissa's eyes glanced at the screen, then down at the suitcase, then back to Helen. "This bag's over the carry-on limit. It's 9.3 kilograms. Our limit is 7. Helen blinked slowly. "Yes, but most of that weight is my prosthetic leg. I can't wear it for the flight. It's too heavy on my spine, but I need it when I land." Marissa didn't look up from the computer. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to remove items or pay an $85 excess baggage fee." Helen opened the case, showing the neatly wrapped prosthetic. "I'm not carrying extra clothes, just essentials and this leg. It's medical. I thought airlines accommodated things like this." A brief pause. Marissa glanced at the growing line behind Helen. People were watching. "With all due respect, ma'am," she said, voice sharp now, "we can't give special priority to things like that. Either remove it or pay the fee. That's policy." The words hit Helen like a slap. Things like that. As if her prosthetic, an extension of her very body, her independence, her dignity, was just excess baggage. Helen felt her throat tighten. She fumbled through her purse, pulling out a leather coin pouch. Her hands trembled as she dug through nickels and quarters, trying to make up the fee. The scene felt surreal, stripped down to loose change, bent with age, fighting to bring her own leg onto a plane. Some passengers looked away. A few whispered. One woman nearby muttered, "Can't they just let her through?" Just as Helen dropped a quarter that rolled across the floor, a voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." A tall man in his late 30s stepped forward from the line. Dressed in business casual, his eyes were firm, voice calm but commanding. "My name is Marcus Evans. I'm a disability rights attorney. And that sentence you just said, it violates the Americans with Disabilities Act." Marissa froze. Helen looked up, her eyes glassy with a mix of confusion and hope. Marcus continued, "A medically necessary prosthetic is not optional, nor is it subject to arbitrary airline weight fees. This woman doesn't need to pay to carry her own leg." He turned to Helen gently. "Ma'am, do you mind if I assist you?" Helen nodded, unable to speak. He picked up her suitcase and turned to the stunned Marissa. "This is going on the plane, for free, and I'll be filing a complaint with your airline." As Marcus gently guided Helen toward the boarding gate, the atmosphere around them shifted. Whispers followed their steps like shadows. Some passengers watched curiously. Others turned away out of discomfort or guilt. Helen, still shaken, clutched the handle of her suitcase with her lighter prosthetic leg, clicking softly beneath her dress pants. They reached a bench near the gate. Marcus offered to get her water, but Helen simply smiled and said, "You already did enough, son. More than most have in a lifetime." He smiled, but his eyes held a quiet fury. "I just did what anyone should do," he said. "You shouldn't have had to defend your leg like it was luggage." Helen chuckled. the sound tinged with sadness. I've defended my whole life, dear. My body, my dignity, my right to move. It never ends. As Marcus sat beside her, Helen began to talk. Not just about the flight or the prosthetic, but about life. She spoke of the year she lost her leg. She'd been living alone after her husband passed. The infection came fast, the doctors even faster. By the time she could make peace with the idea of surgery, it had already happened. What they don't tell you, she said, is that it's not just your leg you lose. It's your rhythm, your sense of normal. You suddenly learn how much dignity you carried in simply standing upright. She paused, looking down at her feet, one natural, the other a lightweight polymer substitute. I bought the heavier one to feel like myself again, to walk into a room without wobbling, to dance at Lily's birthday party. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then asked gently, "Do you want to report what happened back there?" Helen looked toward the gate, then shook her head. "I don't want someone fired. I want someone trained. Compassion isn't automatic. It's taught. And too many people never learn it." Just then a gate agent called out, "Pre-boarding now open for passengers needing assistance or additional time to board." Marcus stood. "Shall we?" Helen nodded and rose slowly, leaning slightly on his arm. As they approached the gate, a few passengers stepped aside, making room without being told. One even touched Helen's shoulders softly and whispered, "I hope your trip is beautiful." It was a small moment, but it meant everything. At the gate, another young agent scanned her boarding pass and smiled brightly. "Welcome aboard, ma'am." But before she could move forward, a stern voice interrupted. "Hold on." Everyone turned. It was the original check-in attendant, Marissa. She had come up the concourse holding a tablet. Her expression was tight, but her voice wavered. I just wanted to say, I looked up the ADA guidelines. You were right. I was wrong. And I'm sorry." The air stood still. Helen looked her in the eye, not with anger, but with clarity. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "That apology means more than the $85. Marissa's shoulders loosened slightly. "I'll talk to my manager about adding sensitivity training to our staff meetings. I didn't know better." "Now I will." Helen gave her a nod. "That's all I ever wanted." With that, she boarded. And not just the plane, but a flight into a better chapter. The prosthetic leg that once felt like a burden now symbolized something far more powerful, resilience wrapped in metal and grace. Helen moved carefully down the airplane aisle, her cane tapping softly against the cabin floor. A flight attendant offered assistance, but she politely declined, proud of her ability to manage alone, at least for now. Her seat was 14A, a window seat in the middle of the aircraft. She placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment with some help and settled into her seat, adjusting the lumbar support with a deep breath. Her temporary prosthetic sat stiffly under her skirt, but she knew she'd need to switch to the heavier one once she landed. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. The plane filled quickly. A few rows ahead, parents juggled toddlers and iPads. Business people opened laptops. Across the aisle, in seat 14C, sat a sharply dressed man with sleek shoes and a briefcase at his feet. He glanced at Helen with a tight, polite smile, then returned to his phone. Helen didn't mind the silence, but moments later she caught the man subtly looking at her legs, then at her cane, then at her face. She offered a kind smile and sensing his curiosity. "You traveling for work?" she asked gently. He paused. "Yes, client meeting in Portland." She nodded. "Me too, but my client is 10 years old and thinks I'm bringing cookies." He chuckled lightly. "That's the best kind of client." They fell into an easy conversation. His name was Daniel, mid-40s, and he worked in consulting. Helen shared that she used to be a librarian. Before Kindles ruined everything," she joked. As the flight lifted off, turbulence shook the plane. Helen closed her eyes and steadied her breathing. Her knuckles tightened around the armrest. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked. "I'm fine. Don't," she replied, though her voice wavered. He hesitated, then asked, "Your leg, does it hurt when the plane shifts?" She looked at him, surprised by the question's empathy. "No." This one's light, almost like it's not real, but the real one's in the bag above us. I'll need it when I land. Daniel leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Is it weird that I've never thought about prosthetics like that? I always assumed people just wore them, all the time. Helen smiled. That's what most people think, but they're not all the same. Some are too heavy for long flights. Some pinch. Some feel more like armor than limbs. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. You've taught me more in 5 minutes than I've read in years. As the flight continued, Helen drifted off to sleep for a while. When she woke, Daniel was still beside her, reading an article on disability rights. She glanced at the screen and raised an eyebrow. Curious? He smiled sheepishly. Let's just say I'm learning how to be a better seatmate. Suddenly, a commotion came from the back of the cabin. A passenger had collapsed. Flight attendants rushed with equipment, paging for a doctor. Panic spread through the rows. Daniel stood. I'm CPR certified. Need help? He followed the attendants down the aisle. Helen clutched her armrest, heart racing, not from fear, but from the surreal quiet that filled the air after he left. Then 10 minutes later, Daniel returned. He was pale, sweating. The man's okay, he said, sitting down. Low blood sugar, but they may reroute the flight just in case. Helen looked at him with newfound admiration. You saved someone. Daniel shook his head. I just did what I could. He reminded me of my father. They sat in silence again. Then Helen said softly, That's what people like us do. We carry what's heavy, even when the world doesn't see it. Daniel turned to her, expression serious. That includes prosthetics too, doesn't it? Helen smiled. That includes everything. As the plane began its descent into Portland, Helen stared out the window. The city lights sparkled beneath the early evening sky like a quiet welcome. Her heart fluttered, not with fear this time, but anticipation. She hadn't seen Lily in 3 years, not since the girl lost her 2 front teeth and called every grown-up captain because of her pirate face. Her prosthetic leg, the heavier one, waited patiently above in the overhead compartment. She knew she couldn't carry it and her cane at the same time while deplaning, so she had decided to wait until the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers rustled to life. Daniel stood to help Helen first. Wait here. I'll get your leg. She smiled. You're quite the gentleman for a business consultant. He grinned. I'll take that as a promotion. As he carefully retrieved the suitcase and opened it to reveal the prosthetic, something in the surrounding cabin shifted. A few passengers nearby took notice. Some looked surprised. Others tried to act like they didn't. Daniel knelt down to help her fit the prosthetic. Helen braced herself. It wasn't easy. The pressure, the awkward angle, the quiet embarrassment of being watched. It all returned. But she gritted her teeth. Daniel steadied her hand. You've got this. Once the leg was secured, Helen rose slowly. Taller, straighter. Not pain-free, but powerful. The flight attendant near the door noticed and said warmly, You didn't need a wheelchair? Helen shook her head. Just needed to carry myself with the right weight. Daniel offered to walk her through the terminal, but Helen politely declined. You've already carried more than most men do in a year. Promise me you'll let Lily tell you you're the coolest grandma alive, he said. Helen winked. I won't stop her. They parted ways at the gate, but before Daniel walked off, he slipped a small folded note into her hand. Read it later, he said. Helen made her way through the airport alone, but not lonely. Every step with her prosthetic was deliberate, heavy but proud. She passed by other elderly travelers in wheelchairs, young families, people rushing with earbuds in and eyes on screens. No one noticed her, and yet she noticed everyone. Outside the terminal, Lily and her mother waited with a bright pink sign that read, Grandma Helen is here. The girl squealed and ran full speed into her arms. Helen bent down, despite the pain, and hugged her so tightly it made the prosthetic creak. You kept your promise, Lily yelled. Of course, Helen whispered into her hair. Nothing could stop me. That night, after Lily fell asleep curled up with a teddy bear, Helen sat on the guest room bed and unfolded Daniel's note. It read, Dear Helen, you reminded me that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it limps, sometimes it leans on a cane, and sometimes it sits in a suitcase waiting for someone to believe it deserves a place on board. Thank you for teaching me more about dignity in 3 hours than I've learned in my entire career. Helen folded the letter, closed her eyes, and exhaled deeply. She had carried a leg, but somehow she had helped carry someone else's heart too. 2 weeks had passed since Helen Parker returned from Portland. The visit had been everything she dreamed of. Lily's wide smile, the cupcakes with way too much frosting, the sound of children's laughter echoing through the backyard. But even after the joy, something still lingered inside Helen. The moment at the airport when she was told her leg didn't deserve space. She had tried to let it go. She told herself it was one person's mistake, not the world's fault. But then the dreams began. She'd wake up with her heart racing, seeing the airline counter over and over again, hearing the words, "We don't prioritize items from deceased people." Only this time in her dreams it was her own dignity being discarded. One morning she sat down at her kitchen table and opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard before she began to type, asterisk to the customer relations department. My name is Helen Parker. I'm 85 years old, a retired librarian, a grandmother, and an amputee. 2 weeks ago, I attempted to board Flight 319 from Dallas to Portland with a medically necessary prosthetic leg inside my carry-on. I was told I'd have to pay a penalty because the bag exceeded the airline's 7 kilograms limit. The employee refused to recognize the prosthetic as a medical necessity. When I explained, she replied, "We don't prioritize items from deceased people." That sentence was cruel, but worse, it was ignorant. My prosthetic is not an item. It is part of my body. Without it, I cannot move with dignity or freedom. What happened that day was not just an error. It was a reminder of how invisible people like me still are. I'm not writing for revenge. I'm writing because I want your airline to be better. I want training for your staff. I want elderly and disabled travelers to be seen, not as burdens, but as human beings with stories, struggles, and the right to respect. Sincerely, Helen Parker, asterisk. She hit send, and then silence. For days she heard nothing. She had almost given up. But then a letter arrived in the mail, thick, embossed with the airline's gold logo. Inside was a handwritten note from the company's Vice President of Customer Experience. Dear Miss Parker, your letter did not just reach our inbox. It reached our conscience. I read it aloud in a meeting with all our department heads. We were ashamed, and we were moved. Thanks to your bravery, we are launching a company-wide Human First initiative. Every frontline staff member will now receive mandatory disability awareness and empathy training. Your sentence, "My prosthetic is not an item, it is part of my body," will be printed in our internal training guide as a quote. You changed us, Miss Parker. We are also refunding your entire travel fare and issuing you lifetime priority boarding status. But most of all, we are grateful, not just for your voice, but for reminding us of the people behind every seat number. Sincerely, Christopher Hale, VP, Customer Experience, Blue Horizon Airlines. Helen read the letter twice, then once more. Tears gathered in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the weight of being heard, being seen, being respected. She didn't need applause. She didn't need a banner or a commercial or a news story. And she had her voice, and that was enough. That Sunday, at her local church, the pastor asked her to speak during the community sharing session. Helen stood slowly, leaning on her cane, and said, "Last month I carried a leg in a suitcase and was told it didn't matter. This week I used my voice and discovered it carried farther than any flight ever could." The congregation applauded. Lily ran up afterward and whispered, "Grandma, you're kind of famous now." Helen laughed. "Not famous, sweetie. Just finally heard."